Riverside.
Welcome, Rabbi Michael, to the show. How are you today, Rabbi?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad to have this conversation with you. I'm looking forward to seeing where God leads our discussion.
Me too. Can't wait.
So I'm going to give you an easy question to kind of warm you up a little bit. What's the best advice you ever received?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Actually, when I was studying to become a rabbi, which I actually did when I graduated rabbinical school when I was 41, so I did it later in life. It wasn't that I was for 20 years in rabbinical school, no, but and I was very concerned about the thing that worried me the most was about the pastoral counseling, when someone comes to you and asks you, the really hard questions about, why am I dying? Why am I suffering? And the best advice I got, so I was taking a pastoral counseling class in the seminary, and the teacher said, the thing you have to know is you don't have to have an answer. Some things don't have answers, and that was really liberating to me. And I discovered that the thing that I was most afraid of in my future rabbinate, being a clergy person, was something I did pretty well, because actually I'm a good listener, and I think most often what people really want is to feel listened to and heard. And the truth is there aren't answers I think for the most difficult questions, but being with people, for them to feel listened to and accompanied rather than alone and often afraid, that was the best wisdom that I got. So thank you for reminding me that.
My pleasure. I had a similar kind of thing coming out of seminary too. I was wondering, how are you present for people when they're in need? And someone just said that, and you said it too. It's just be present. We don't need you to solve it. Just be present. And that is very freeing, that you can just be there, be a sense of encouragement and hope by just your presence in the situation. And so, yeah, that's good.
No, and sometimes there's the other thing. I became a rabbi when I was 41, and I can't imagine being like a clergy person at the age of 24 or 25, right? Because you have, life experience, and you've dealt with some of these things, or you've encountered them, and occasionally you have some wisdom. Occasionally there is something helpful that not just the listening, but you can share some of your experience, and people feel, there's some wisdom there that I can, whether it's from the tradition, from the Bible, or just from your own life.
Unfortunately, I was 26 when so I had to learn that the tough way.
I can't imagine, particularly when situations that are really tough, real tragedies, like how do you, at that age, like what do you know?
Right.
And that's the same thing. It's, having the humility to know you don't know, right?
Right.
And let's just be together.
Exactly. So, Rabbi, tell us something about yourself that most people don't know. True confession time.
Can we get to the hard questions? Which are really easy. Something that, many people don't know that I have an unusual hobby. I collect signs from old synagogues and Jewish institutions that are closing. And all these signs are of no value, no monetary value, and would end up in a dumpster. But actually, I have 500 of these signs.
Wow.
So the next question is, where do you keep them? Because they're, some of them are, 2 feet by 3 feet, but, I have some that are 4 or 5 feet long. So we actually have a second home, and we have a basement there, so that we keep a lot of them hanging there. But it's really they tell a story, a story of American Jewish life in the 20th century, a story like the story of many people in America, of people coming to this country and from a different country and with a different language they grew up with, and how they become acculturated and assimilated in America. And it's part of the great story of America, and an ongoing story. And this is a subset of that. And it's what's called material culture. These actual things tell a story. And you have to ask, since they didn't have computers, to just type it out and print it, we'll put up a notice. Someone had to actually make the sign. So it was an effort. So every time, you have to ask why they make it. I mean, some of them are just the least interesting, are the name of the synagogue, but the ones that are more interesting tell something about what they were interested in or what they were concerned about. So there's a sign that says, when you make a donation to the synagogue, make sure you give it to Mr. Goldstein, who's the only person authorized to take the donation. So, and I have a couple of these from different synagogues, and I realized this obviously was a problem, that people would say, "Oh, give me the donation, I'll make it sure to get to the office," and it never made it to the office. So they actually had to make a sign to hang up there, like, like, no, here's the procedure. Like this guy, and it's very specific. It has his name. So it's, they're humorous and interesting, and often tell a little bit of a story.
I love that. Sounds like your next book right there is kind of telling the story of the sign.
I've thought about, doing, it would be a nice, an interesting coffee table type book.
Right. Love that. So I'm curious, Rabbi, who are some people in your life who serve as inspiration for you?
Some people are, very prominent, public figures, like, Martin Luther King would be, an example of, my father, who was also a rabbi, he's passed away, but he marched with Dr. King in Selma. And,
wow.
And I remember him coming back and telling stories about the experience. So, people like that are, and then, there's someone who I admire, is one of my grandparents, my mother's father, he wasn't a rabbi. He belonged to a synagogue and was a lay person who participated, but he wasn't particularly, he did some leadership, but mostly he was just a member, right? And there's, in the Jewish tradition, there's a blessing to say after you eat a meal, the sort of grace after meals, it's called. And it's actually kind of fairly long. It's like a couple of pages in Hebrew, right? And there's a song that many people sing to it, which becomes, kind of rote, you sing it a lot. But my grandfather, he didn't sing it. He would, take his glasses off. He always wore glasses. He'd take his glasses off just to concentrate on what he was doing. And he would, in the Jewish tradition, you're actually supposed to say your prayers. You vocalize your prayers. You don't just say it silently to yourself. You're supposed. So he would say it quietly, but you could hear like him saying the words, and and it took him maybe like 10 minutes because it's a long prayer, and he was just completely focused on doing it. And when you do something that you do like every day, it's hard not for it to become kind of, just like say it, get it done with, it by heart, right? You could do it in your sleep. And he never did that. And he was one of the few people I've met in Jewish life who clearly was, he was there. He was present as he was saying those words. And it was a kind of remarkable example of, what in his own simple way was completely devotional and meaningful and such an example.
Wow, that's powerful. What a powerful legacy he left behind for you.
Thanks.
So, Rabbi, tell us your personal story, your journey to where you were before to where you are now, and what led you to write the book.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, my father was a rabbi. He was an Orthodox rabbi. So, in Judaism, there are a number of different denominations or streams, and Orthodox is the most traditional. In Orthodoxy, there's actually two groups you might call the sort of the ultra Orthodox, the most traditional, and there's the modern Orthodox, who are people who are Orthodox in terms of they follow all the commandments, all the rules, all the practices, but also want to embrace modernity, and that's partly a response, like all of the denominations are responding to the challenges of modernity. And so that was the denomination that I grew up in, a modern Orthodox. And my father was a rabbi, and so I attended synagogue regularly with him. And I went to a Hebrew day school, which is equivalent of a Jewish parochial school, where we studied, obviously, regular studies, but also had Jewish studies and studied Jewish texts and studied the Bible in Hebrew, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so that was my growing up. But since then, I've journeyed from there, leaving Orthodoxy to, more liberal forms of Judaism, beginning in college, which probably happens to many people. And there was a thing called a movement called the Jewish Counterculture. This was the late 60s, early 70s, when there was in the United States the general counterculture, which was a whole bunch of things, but were sort of young people who were rebelling or being counter the culture that they, as they perceived it, of their parents and of existing, and it had to do with issues, political issues broadly, the war in Vietnam, it had to do with civil rights, it had to do with sexual mores, there was a dress. You should see the picture of me from those days with really long hair, which many people my age in America had, not everybody, but many. And there was a Jewish counterculture as well, which was in somewhat similar ways saying, we don't like the Jewish culture or the Jewish religion that we're inheriting from our parents. We want something that is more active, more engaging, which calls upon people to be involved. And so I was involved in a book called The Jewish Catalog, which came out actually 50 years ago, celebrating its 50th anniversary, which its subtitle was A Do-It-Yourself Kit, which was saying, like, don't be passive about this. Don't. It isn't only the clergy that are supposed to be up in front of the the synagogue and leading the services and saying the service, and everybody else is sitting there very quietly. But no, people should be participating in the services and more broadly in Jewish life. It isn't only rabbis who are supposed to do the Jewish practices, but every Jew is called upon to do that. And so that became, for a long time, my definition of my Judaism. And some years, I'm going to bring this to a conclusion so it doesn't go forever, but some years later, there was the influence of what I would call spirituality and meditation, and I incorporated that into my Judaism, and as I mentioned, at some point I decided to become a rabbi. I became a rabbi at the age of 41. I was a rabbi of one congregation in Manhattan, and then left that and went to a second congregation, and then retired and felt I wanted to write this book, Judaism Disrupted, a Spiritual Manifesto for the 21st Century. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So.
All right. I love that. The journey is interesting. I always think it's important to know how we get to where we are, to understand, especially the moment in time that we find ourselves as believers, because the things are very challenging. And there does seem to be, I think on the horizon, I'm sensing a second cultural revolution. I mean, things are starting to bubble up, and you're seeing people become more engaged than they have been before. And in that regard, I have this question for you, because I'm kind of curious from your perspective. You say that after 2 centuries of challenges, the future of Judaism is uncertain. What do you mean by that? It's uncertain.
I think we live in challenging times, or we live in disruptive times. That's the title of the book. And in some ways, we're still responding to the challenges of modernity. Modernity so changed the world from the previous world, the world of the Middle Ages. I like to say that in the Middle Ages, God was at the center, and people were kind of on the side. In the modern world, people are center, right? And we really believe in the power of what we can do as individuals. We see the world from that perspective. And God is often, put to the weekends, right? Saturday or Sunday, so that's a fundamental change on perspective. And so I think the challenge for all religions was how to respond to that. And people did it in different ways. Some say, let's hold on to the traditions. We have to hold fast in the face of these challenges. Let's not change anything. Let's keep the old time religion. And others said, no, it's important to adapt to it. And I know the Jewish story particularly, because it's my story, as it were. So there was the reform movement that said we have to reform, we have to change things. And then the conservative came and said, yeah, we have to change things, but reform, you're doing too much. Let's be a little bit more conservative with a small c, right? And the rabbinical school I went to was a Reconstructionist, which is the smallest of these denominations, and many people, even people in the Jewish community, haven't heard of it. And the notion there is that we need to respond to the needs of the moment. That each generation, there are different challenges and different needs, and so Judaism needs to be reconstructed. Big word, but really just to respond to now, and yet with all that, I think here in the 21st century, Judaism, and I would say across the board, religion, and I'm particularly talking about the United States, but I think it's true in many places in the world, and some people think Europe has become much more secularized than America has. There's one could look and see that the number of people who in surveys who define themselves as nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S, that is none of the above, who feel not a part of any religious tradition, is increasing. And the number of people who are affiliated with churches and synagogues and mosques is broadly, again, declining. There's always some places that are booming and new ideas and new movements, or particularly talented clergy. But I think we need to face that challenge. And for me, I both come out of the tradition, but I'm also willing and think it's important to change the tradition. I think we need to try and meet the moment, and just tinkering around the edges, I think, is not going to do it. So that's why I think it's challenging times, and it's not clear that the Jewish institutions and organizations and practices that carried us through the 20th century will carry us to the end of the 21st century, never mind into the 23rd century.
Right. I can't speak for Judaism, but I can speak for some of my sect. Whenever we talk about the word change or reconstruction, people get really nervous because they're afraid of losing the core of the faith. So as you look at kind of on the Judaism side of it, what do you think is missing in today's Jewish culture that you're trying to help recapture or reemphasize again for those believers?
I think for too many people, they don't see the connection between Jewish ritual and Jewish practices and prayer, and they don't see the connection between them and anything that they really care about in their lives. It just feels like it's old, it's archaic, it's nostalgia. People do it just because we always did it. And I think for an increasing number of the people, they feel that's not enough, right? So there are things. So the Passover Seder, there's a ritual meal on Passover, which the overwhelming number of Jews participate in, and there's a text that's read and songs that's sung, and things for the kids to do. That's a tradition that remains popular, that people feel connected to. Sometimes this is a family thing. It's a kind of, in some ways, a piece of it is like a Jewish Thanksgiving. There's this meal, you gather a family. So people will do that. I think, in 50, 70 years ago, there were Jews who were embarrassed about being Jewish and would change their names to kind of hide. Nobody does that anymore. The question is it going to be an important part of your identity or just a minor thing? And I think for too many people, they feel that there's not much there. And they think, the key thing in the book is they think that the important thing about being Jewish is to do the Jewish rituals, to do what I call the Jewishly Jewish things. That is, the things that only Jews do, right? Only Jews keep kosher, have a Jewish set of dietary laws. Like nobody else does that, right? Or observe certain Jewish holidays, but nobody else does those. But that's not what it's about. What I think Judaism is about is taking the most precious gift that we have been given, which is our lives, and with the wisdom and practices of Judaism, live those lives with meaning and purpose. And if Judaism is perceived as being helpful in that, then I think people will want to be involved. And if they feel it's irrelevant to any of the important issues in people's lives, then they're going to say, I'm going to look elsewhere for meaning. There's, I can go to a therapist for help. Why am I going to go? What am I going to find in religion?
That's an interesting point, because we have that same struggle oftentimes in my church body when it comes down to, you talk about rituals, our worship service, our liturgical service. Sometimes people becomes very rote, becomes very traditional, and the argument some people make is we can lose sight of the power behind the liturgy if we don't connect the liturgy back to meaning. And so I get what you're saying, is that you want to make sure that people don't just do it because you always do it, but you tie it back to, for us, the connection with God. How do we connect with God, and God really connect with us? Worship is kind of the work of us doing that together. How do we have that relationship with God through that divine service? So I get what you're saying, is that how do you make sure you're not just doing ritual's sake, but you're doing it as it connects you back to the Almighty?
Right. And, and there are particular challenges for Jewish services, because basically they're in Hebrew, which, very few people, speak fluently. So, so then it's all in translation, as it were. So, Jewish services are, the Sabbath morning service, Saturday morning service, there's a range in terms of how traditional the services are, et cetera. And some attempt to shorten them, but they can be 2.5, 3 hours. And that's a long time. In the world we live in, where everything is measured by the speed of our computers rather than, miles per hour, which that was pretty fast, but now it's super fast. There are not a lot of things that are 2.5 hours long in our world these days.
No, they're not.
And the ones that are, like theater, they spend like fortunes and have huge staffs to pull them off, right? But the bottom line is really what you were saying, that does this feel connected? Does it one way, does it make me feel connected to the divine, to a sense that there's something larger than myself in my life? Does it feel spiritually nourishing? I come with questions. Does it help me reflect on my inner qualities? These are all different ways or different pieces that people could relate to religion, spirituality, and particular services. But too often it feels like, we start on page 39 and we can finish on page 221. And, it's just, going through it. And why do we do it? Because this is the way we've always done it. And it's, it's very hard to change things. And I think you said this, that people, worried about change, worried about losing the things that they feel connected to. We've had it like, we're going to change the tune, to a hymn. And they said, no, we like that tune, we don't change that, and we say, well, we just, we'll sing that sometimes too, but we'll vary the thing. It's, someone introduced that tune at some point. Moses didn't sing this at Sinai. I can assure you that tune isn't, going back to the beginning, right? So somebody wrote it, somebody introduced it, and somebody in their congregation said, no, we don't want the new tune. We want the old tune. So it's, and the more seriously, it's a challenge. How do you change things but keep the sense of authenticity and connection to the past. And those are ongoing challenges.
Very, very true. You know, in your book, you say that there are 11 core principles that should define Judaism. For those who don't know, what would you say those 11 core principles are?
Oh, usually I don't run through and list them all, because it's like too long. So there's
We got 2.5 hours. No,
Oh, okay.
no.
Oh, it's a service. All right. Well, just to make them good, I'll do them in Hebrew. Then nobody will understand. No. So I'll do the ones that come to mind. It'll be interesting to see what. So, one is that the first is that we're all created in the divine image, right? And so you take what's a large principle, and then you say, well, what follows from that, right? So obviously what follows from that is that I'm challenged to treat everybody else as a divine image, right? And that's a particular challenge in these divided partisan times, because there are people that I really disagree with and people who really disagree with me, right? And how do you hold on to that? And I think having it as a religious principle, the Declaration of Independence says the same thing, that we're all created equal. But I think there's that language, I think, makes the challenge even greater, because it says each of us is in a divine image. There is no person that's not created in a divine image. So there are no exceptions to the rule, right? The second principle is at the end of each day of creation, God says about creation, ki tov, it is good. And I noticed that good is subjective. God could have said, it's finished, right? Check off day one, check off day. And but good is saying that the world isn't a random world. There's values and there's purpose. And the challenge to each of us is to try and end each day by saying, I did good today. I tried to do good. And knowing that there'll be days that, it didn't work out, and days I did good and I actually, messed up a bunch as well. And then their important teaching for me is that holiness can be found anywhere. It's a teaching of Hasidism, which is a Jewish pietistic movement that began in the 18th century and is an important source of Jewish spirituality. It's a traditional source. It goes back a couple hundred years, but it has a lot of texts that echo with contemporary spiritual language about awareness and mindfulness. And they say that holiness can be everywhere, and that means holiness isn't just doing praying or studying Jewish texts or doing eating matzah, unleavened bread at Passover, but anything you're doing has the potential to be a holy moment, to bring God into the room, to bring holiness, a sense of specialness. So a conversation, like we're having, can be a holy moment. Taking a walk with a friend, and I'm not trying to trivialize it, but anything has that potential, and that feels to me like a major and important teaching. And then some other things I'll just mention quickly is to kind of to strive for a sense of awareness, of paying attention, and I would add to that part of the way I'm trying to redefine ritual practices as saying that they're about bringing your mindfulness. They're meant to bring your attention to blessings in your life, perhaps, to the wonders of nature, to some of the challenges, you're facing in your inner personality, that they're not just, okay, we're supposed to do this because it said someplace it's supposed to do it, but it's to bring our attention to these important ideas and themes. And then there's one principle is the call to social justice, which goes right from the beginning with Abraham, and then there's a principle about taking care of this planet, which I think is, maybe 60 years ago wouldn't have been one of the core principles, but now I think it's definitely one of them. And I've left out some, but I'm sure. And one is that the study of Torah. Torah is the word for the biblical text, but it also means all of Jewish tradition, all the commentaries on it. That's a lifelong enterprise. Like, you never graduate from Torah study. There's no degree. You continue, because it's not about accumulating knowledge. It's about encountering the text, bringing yourself to the text, trying to hear what the text is saying to you. There is that dialogue that is ongoing, and trying to hear what the word is for this very moment, and that's a lifelong enterprise. So those are, at least. Oh, and I was going to have 10 because 10's a good number, 10 commandments, etc. But I realized I needed the 11th, which was community, because I wanted to make sure that people didn't think that you could do Judaism just by yourself, and that it's, if I could get salvation or nirvana or whatever, then that's fine. Judaism is really lived in community. Like I like to say, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself is really easy if you don't have any neighbors. And it's really hard if you do have real people who are your neighbors. And that's what it's all about. It's about living with the challenges of reality, of real life, not living in some fantasy.
And those principles apply to all of us and across the board. I mean, those are principles that would work well in the Christian religion as well, because we value all those things, and they're an important part of what we do. We talk about the fact that for us, our kids go through we call catechism, and after age of 13, it's kind of reaffirming their baptism, but we don't say you don't graduate once you get done with those classes as a 13, 14-year-old, but it's a lifelong journey of growing in your faith and reading God's word and studying those things and being a part of worship. So those are all key. And I love those. Those are really good principles. And if we could all model after those core principles, I think our world would be a much kinder, more reflective place of the divine God.
Right. Right.
I do want to talk just because I've seen a lot lately in the headlines about Jewish people and anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, and it's troubling for me to see the anti-Semitism in our culture, especially pop culture. As a Jewish person, how does that impact your people, and kind of how do you, as a Jew, work through this burden that's kind of on your people?
Well, it's challenging, and what's unfortunate is that again, like maybe 25 years ago, I would have said, yes, there's some anti-Semitism, but it's really decreased, from what it was, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in America in the 1920s and 30s, and then partly because of when the news of the Holocaust came to America after World War II, I think there was a movement, a receding of that. It wasn't acceptable, and And as I say, I would have said, 25, 30 years ago, I would say, yeah, it's not much of a problem. But now, it clearly is a problem. And you can't, and there's enough incidents that you can't just say it's like one or two, people who are, whatever, disturbed or whatever, or bad, whatever. So it is a problem. It's a real problem. And it's a reflection, I think, of the larger challenges in our society of division. And I think it's also a reflection of that we live in disruptive times. And in disruptive times, people feel like the ground that they thought they were standing on isn't there anymore. And that is very scary and very disturbing. And it lets people suggest that there's simple answers or conspiracy theories to explain this, which, the conspiracy theories are, crazy, and simple answers to the most important issues are never true, right? Otherwise we would solve the problem of homelessness if it was obvious, or anything else, right? So the people go to bad places, and they forget the thing we were just talking about. Like, if we're all created in the image of God, then how can you be an anti-Semite?
Right.
We're all created. There's no little asterisk except for the following kind of people.
People group, right?
Right. So it's all of us, right? And it doesn't take away from, okay, there's good ways to behave and bad ways to behave. Good and bad are still important categories. But I think, we were headed towards a society that was striving to be more inclusive, welcoming more people, acknowledging that people do things that are they want to live their lives in very different ways, but we could be a place that's not what I would do. It's not even something that I particularly like or admire, but that person has the right to do that. And that person still remains a person. And they may be mistaken, but they're not bad people because they want to live a different life than the life that I've chosen. But that is, it's hard to see that. And people say, well, you shouldn't compromise. And I say, I don't understand. There's a phrase in Hebrew, or the highest form of justice is mishpat shalom. It's justice of peace. Shalom, peace, right? And that means that instead of, if you and I are arguing about something, I win and you, we're in court or whatever, and I win and you lose. No, the court comes to some place of compromise where I felt, okay, I didn't win everything, but I was listened to and I got some of what I want. And you also feel the same thing, right? And so true justice is when both people feel justice was done. Maybe not completely the way that I would have wanted or chosen, but that there's a sense that, there is, to be just to both sides of the argument, that's real justice. That's amazing justice. And we're so far from that because it's all win or lose. And that's the context for, anti-Semitism and racism and everything else that is, and intolerance and judgment, being always judgmental about people with whom you don't agree. And I think that's a real danger in our society. I don't think there's any other way to talk and think about that. This is not good, and And it's, my book's focused about Judaism, but I think it's a challenge to see how our society is going to move forward in a healthy way with that kind of division and that kind of othering of people, saying, right, yeah, we're all created in the image of God, except not really.
Right, except not those people.
Right.
That's very powerful. So I'd like to ask my guest this question, Rabbi. What is a legacy you want to leave behind in the world?
Well, it's the story of my life has been about Judaism. Even though I didn't become a rabbi till later in life, and Judaism has been really central. And in some way, all the books I've written have been an attempt to take the richness of the tradition that I grew up in and make it accessible to people who didn't have that background. I mean, my background is unusual for people who are in the liberal Jewish community, and because I think there's great richness in the tradition, and great wisdom, and not answers, because I don't think there are answers to the most difficult questions, but there are things that are helpful. There are wisdom that feels helpful, like, like this will help me when I'm facing this. I should remember that, right? That even if I should remember that, that person who I'm arguing with, they're trying their best, and they see things differently. And as long as, we're talking to each other rather than talking at each other, right? Then this is a conversation, and I'm not going to be able to convince them, and they're not going to be able to convince me, but we can agree to disagree, and maybe I'll learn something from that, and maybe we'll find a compromise that each of us gets something, but not the whole thing. So I would hope that people would find in this book, and I mean, it's very Jewish, but I think, as you said, the issues are broad issues. They're issues for everybody, and may find ways of looking at things, even for people in a different tradition. That's we could apply that. We have that kind of statement. Jesus said, and okay, the rabbi said this, and Jesus said that, and like it's nice to remember that. Or this is I encourage people to, in the book, that create a practice of starting each day with spiritual intention, which they can do in a minute. They don't have to pray a whole service, and actually take the moment of transition from home to going outside. And in the Jewish tradition, there's this little box that we put on the doorpost. It's called the mezuzah, which has a piece of the Bible on a scroll in there, and just to take a moment at that and say, I want to take with me my keys, my cell phone, and a spiritual intention for the day that I'm going to carry with me, and hopefully it will infuse my day at moments. It'll come back to me, or you can even make it specific and say, look, I know I have this really difficult meeting this afternoon, so my intention for today is I want to carry with me a little bit extra measure of patience that I'm going to bring into that meeting, and maybe that'll help me, and maybe it'll help everybody, have a meeting where we, as I said, we will hear each other rather than yell at each other. And that's what the spiritual life is about in all its different forms. And I would hope that the book would be so my legacy would be that some people would say, yeah, I learned, I'm going to do that practice when I leave in the morning, or I'm going to do something else he talked about in the book, or I don't like how he framed it, but I'm going to come up with my own version. And then, as you said, the world may be, in small ways, a better place, for each of us and for all of us.
I love that. So, Rabbi, where can people find your book, and where can they find you on social media?
So, my book, just so you get the title again, Judaism Disrupted, Spiritual Manifesto for the 21st Century. But if you just remember the first part, Judaism Disrupted, and you can get it, at lots of the regular places, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's published by Ben Yehuda Press. If you remember that, you can get it from them. I have a website. It's michaelstrassfeld.com. It's just my name, Michael Strass. I guess I should spell it. Strass, that's Sam, like it's Sam, Feld. michaelstrassfeld.com. And actually, I have a weekly newsletter, which is free to anybody who would like to subscribe, and free to unsubscribe if you decide you don't want it afterwards. And you can do that on the website. It's really easy to subscribe. And that's a way to weekly have some teaching reflection of mine. So, and thank you. Thank you for all those listening. And thank you a lot, Keith. This has really been an interesting conversation.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate the lessons you've given us to think about. And I like that idea of just take a little bit of spiritual intention with you as you walk out the door, because it's the opportunity, as you also said, to kind of walk into a holy moment or a holy conversation or a holy minute is a powerful thought to think about. Looking for the holiness in the midst of our darkness is a powerful way for us as believers to move forward in the world. So thank you.
Thank you.